Welcome to ReChurch. I'm Marshall Fant, the Director of Church Consulting and Strategic Planning for Gospel Fellowship Association Missions. My purpose is to encourage pastors and church leaders as you refocus, renew, and revitalize your churches. We've established this podcast to offer practical tips and suggestions as you equip disciples to make disciples. This is Marshall Fant with GFA Missions. Welcome back to our podcast, ReChurch. This will be the second podcast of a two-part series on helping ladies in the church. And the purpose of ReChurch is to, the name itself, R-E:(church), everything about the church. And this is equipping one another. And we define a healthy church as a church that glorifies God by equipped disciples, continually making disciples. And part of the disciple-making process is, of course, the Titus 2 model of women helping women. So the purpose of this podcast is to deal with pregnancy loss and other heartbreaking issues from the women's side. And before I introduce our panel here, I want to go back to a statement I said in our first podcast that every church we've been in, except for one, is made up of more women than men. So the purpose of this is to help pastors, pastoral staff, pastors' wives, women in the church, to be equipped to minister to other women in the church during very difficult, heartbreaking times. Okay, so that's kind of where we're going. So first, Dr. Carol Losher, welcome back. Just a brief introduction of yourself again.
Okay, Carol Losher. I trained as an OBGYN and was able to use that training on the mission field about 18 years in West Africa. Now I'm in France, and I don't use those skills in France, but I do go back very frequently to West Africa. I just returned from Togo yesterday, so that's my story.
Thank you, and thanks for ministering to so many. And Rachel?
I'm Rachel Barilla, and missionary. We worked with Carol, and we've been, my husband...
In Cameroon,
and my husband and I have been there for 14 years now.
Great.
And he is actually there right now, and I'm here for just a short time, but it's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you with us in person.
You.
All right, Gretchen.
Gretchen Fant, and we ministered in Rock Hill, South Carolina at Harvest Baptist Church for 21 years, and now we are back in the Greenville, South Carolina area. Actually in Easley is where we're living, but we're working with GFA Missions, and that's what we're doing now. And I have a personal and actually a church relationship with a lot of women and counseling, and I do that quite a bit.
Good. So the purpose of this one, and I'm going to let Carol lead us off. So in our previous podcast, we talked about pregnancy loss, really the miscarriage side of things. And this time we're going to focus more on the stillbirth, and then what are the long-term benefits of ministry in this area. Let Gretchen talk about that, and then really maybe how do you deal with it. So that's kind of what we'll be dealing with. So Carol, if you could, Dr. Losher, kind of explain to us stillbirth versus miscarriage, just to set that stage again, please.
Okay. Generally, we speak of pregnancy loss, but that entails sort of two things. The first would be miscarriage, and a miscarriage generally is much more common. About 80% of the losses are miscarriages, and that tends to be in the first 3 months of pregnancy. Then we talk about stillbirth. Stillbirth is basically a word we use to describe a baby that can easily be identified as a tiny little baby. It has its fingers, toes, eyelids, the features of a baby. And that kind of loss, a stillbirth, can often be held in one's hand, whereas a miscarriage is unlike that.
All right, great. Thank you. All right, so Gretchen, walk us through first, your experience, your testimony through this, and how it affected you both emotionally and spiritually, and as you walked through this. And by the way, just so everybody knows, Dr. Losher was our doctor as we walked down this path. So that's the other reason I forgot to mention that she's involved because she ministered to us, and we learned a lot through that. So Gretchen.
Yes, I actually experienced both a miscarriage and delivery of a stillborn baby, and my miscarriage happened shortly after my last son. My son was born, maybe a couple of years, and it was right at 8 weeks, and I appreciate a lot about what we talked about in the first podcast, the fact that everyone's different. You can't predict a lot of the things. You don't really know how you react, and there's no bad or good about any of it. It's just different. And honestly, the miscarriage I had at 8 weeks did not affect me much. I mean, I knew I was pregnant, and then I lost the baby, and I just accepted that as from the Lord's hand. And it didn't, I mean, it wasn't because I was spiritual. It just didn't really affect me, and I hadn't told anybody, so it wasn't a huge deal. Then about a year or so after that, I was expecting again, and this was really a very different pregnancy for me because my oldest daughter was a nurse since she was about 6 years old. She was a nurse, and she kept all my stats, and she'd tell me every week how big the baby was, and she, would inform me. She's still telling me what to do to this day, but she was even back then telling me, what I should be doing and shouldn't be doing, that sort of thing. She was very much involved, and it was really very neat thing. So, right at my when I was in my 19th week, that back then, that's when they did the ultrasounds, and that's when I went in to have my ultrasound, and immediately after they hooked me up, I'll never forget, he said, there's something wrong here. And what had happened is the child had pulled away from the uterine wall, and I could see it just floating in there. And as I mentioned last time, my first reaction...
Elizabeth was with you.
Elizabeth was with me. I took her with me.
And Carol, you were not the doctor there, right?
No, she was not. Carol was not the one that was there for the ultrasound. But I will never forget that. Just my first reaction was, just leave me alone, And I remember driving home, and my daughter asked me questions, and just not knowing what to do about this. And then, as I mentioned last time, after about 24 hours, the thought of not doing something was making me crazy. And so I called Carol and said, I can't. All I could see was that ultrasound. And I knew there was a baby in there, and I did not want that baby in there anymore. And I knew that, and I was so thankful that she was very sure, that's great. And we went in, and so she was very non-invasive, but Carol was very non-invasive as far as what we did. But anyway, so we did deliver the baby, and here again, can we start? So yeah.
Carol, as you're helping a patient at this point before delivery of the stillborn, is there any words of advice you would give to what kind of questions would you ask a patient to think through at this point?
I like the way that you said questions, because to me, I feel like I can take care of the process medically. It's not that complicated. You're not worrying about doing harm to the baby. But it's important to me at this point to support the mother. So often I'll ask the mother, is there anything you want? Do you have any questions right now? Are we keeping you comfortable enough, et cetera? And it's interesting. Some people are very afraid of a high comfort level. They're more afraid of the analgesia than the process, whereas other people don't want to feel anything, don't want to almost know anything. So I think it's important to say, what do you want?
Okay. And again, I appreciate the way you walked our family through this. So Gretchen, if you can pick it up there, as far as, so you go into delivery.
And this is something that's kind of a little bit almost embarrassing. You talk about the shame and all this in the first podcast. Every single one of those things I think you feel at one point. But I remember the nurses were so sweet, and they took this little baby and they put him in a little basket, and they brought him to me and said, "Do you want to hold him?" And I looked at him, and he looked to me like a picture in a book, of a developing, baby. I looked you could see definitely parts and all that, but I did not want to touch him, and I felt a lot of guilt about that, because I thought, how could you not want to touch your baby? But I don't know why I didn't want to touch him. And to this day, I don't know why, but I didn't want to hold him. I don't know.
But Carol,
I
you
can't-
did. You held him for us.
Oh, yeah, it's strange how there are many deliveries I don't remember, but something that involves a lot of grief tends to make a deep impression. And I do remember that. And naturally, I think there's something that I'm very comfortable with anything like that, frankly. I see it a lot. And I think that as a physician, you're used to handling death as well as life. But I don't think many other people are used to handling death, and then it's your own baby.
Right.
So to me, I find that a lot of people don't reach out and hold that baby. They'll look just like Gretchen. And I didn't realize that it had ever occurred to Gretchen as being unusual that she didn't want to hold that baby, because I've seen that over and over. A lot of people want to see it. They need some closure.
Right.
And I think it's good. But there's nothing magical about holding it. In some people's mind, it's almost a little eerie or odd. So Gretchen's reaction is very normal. And that's just an example how some people feel shame and grief when, from another person's perspective, there should be none there.
Thank you for saying
Thank
that,
you. I'm
Gretchen.
so glad we did this podcast so I could
Rachel.
find out that was a normal reaction, because I have always felt bad about that.
Yeah.
No, it's very normal.
When I was-
Actually, in retrospect, it's more unusual for a mother to pick up the baby, especially a stillbirth that's earlier like that.
Mm-hmm.
That's really the exception.
Okay, Rachel?
I have two instances with the stillbirth, and one of them was actually the baby was born live, but only survived for a couple hours, and the mother never even looked at the baby. I mean, as soon as it was
So
delivered,
you weren't the mother
just-
on this?
No,
Oh,
just
okay.
took it away. She didn't want to.
Yeah.
She
Right.
didn't name it. Didn't want to look at it. Didn't want anybody else looking at it. And then my brother-in-law, his wife, had twins, and one of them they delivered them early because one of them had died.
Right.
And they actually held it. There's a picture of both their hands on the baby, and
And
so
they're
it's-
both okay. It's okay.
It's
Right.
okay.
Is that's
Yeah.
the
It's
whole-
fine. Yes.
Yeah.
It's what works for you, what is best for you
Yeah.
emotionally.
Yeah.
how you
Right,
handle
and
it.
that's where what Carol said in the first podcast was so important, that really most of our, particularly at first, we just need to be there for people. We don't need to be, judging them in any way or confronting them on any wrong ideas, or, just encouraging and upholding them and letting them know this is normal and you're good, you did a great, you're fine, and we're here for you, that sort of thing. And that's really what I felt that I had. We had we did have a funeral for the baby, and
Named him.
David, we named him, and that helped bring closure, and so that was good. But I still, it lasted for a long time. Like I'm telling you, even today when I talk about it, even as long as it's been, and I'm not a particularly emotional person, but I always cry because, and I'm not sure why that is, but
All right, so let's talk about the way God uses this. Okay, so God, again, 2 Corinthians 1, He gives us comfort to try and comfort others. So what have been the ministry opportunities, Gretchen, from this? And Carol and Rachel, you can come in as well. What have been those ministry opportunities as a result of what God took you through here?
I can think of a fairly recent one, and I end up using a lot of the things that helped me. One thing things that helped me was to journal, and because I realized very early on that people can help you, but I needed a word from God. I needed God to really speak to me, and this is a wonderful thing that I really believe when you are going through a difficult time, that you need to beg God for a word from Him, because that's where He has, and I've used this word before, that He has entrusted you with a trial, and I think we need to look at it from that perspective, that I have been entrusted with this, and I always try to eventually, when things have calmed down, I try to convince women, first of all, that there is purpose, that this is not random. And I think Rachel alluded to this a little bit. This is not a random thing. This is God has expanded your ministry, and in ways that you don't even have any idea. And so when I talk to people, I try to convince them of that with verses on trials. There are a lot in James and in First Peter. First Peter is a wonderful book on suffering, and sometimes I'll have them go through the entire book and mark every reference to suffering and what it teaches, or trials. And I just recently talked with a woman that was very interesting how it happened. She called probably about 5 or 6 years ago when we were still pastoring in Rock Hill, because someone had referred her and she had lost a child. But this was a child who was like 6 months old. So this was something I had not experienced. But after dealing with her with the basic, and had been a while, so she was starting to have like what Carol referred to as those bad responses. They're really sin responses when we don't like what the path that God has given us. This is God's path, okay, right. And we don't like it, and that's okay when you're processing. But eventually, you have to come to the point where you realize that God has a purpose for his path, and his ways are not our ways. And this had been probably a couple years down the road, and I told her I said, you've got to be journaling, searching the scriptures. But she had some really, she was going through a really rough time. And so I said to her, bottom line is, you need a word from God. I said, I can tell you all sorts of stuff, and you are a mature believer, you know the scriptures, and I can remind you and stir you up and all these things, but you need to beg God, because when God speaks to you, nothing else matters. And I was thinking of that verse even in refers to salvation when it says, talking about the law, and it says that every mouth may be stopped. I kind of feel like that's the way it is when God speaks to you through his word. You remember those verses, and you remember what God has told you. So I told her that, and then I don't remember talking to her after that, but I saw her and heard her testimony just about 6 months ago, because now we're living in the same area, and we reunited in terms of, she reminded me who she was, and then we talked, and she gave a testimony, and she said when I told her that she started really searching the scriptures and saying, Lord, this is your word. You have got to speak to me through this. You've got to show me. And she said God really just showed her some wonderful verses of where her view of him was wrong, and her view of life and trials and all these. And she can tell you, she remembers those verses. And when God spoke to her through his word, there was no arguing.
And so some other verses on that, Romans chapter 5, I know you've used some of those, starting in verse 3. So, Romans 5:3, because I've heard you say these, but we also glory in our tribulations or in
right.
trials, knowing that tribulation produces right. perseverance, and perseverance produces character, and character produces hope, and the hope does not disappoint, because the love of God has been poured in our hearts through the Holy Spirit has been given to us.
That's a wonderful passage.
So I know that's one passage. Are there other verses that you would recommend that people, if they have not gotten a word from the Lord, they could go to?
Well, what God used for me, and I started journaling, and I started just writing down everything that, this is when verses pop off the page. It's not when you're having a great time and there's no conflict and everything's going great. It's when you're really in despair, or not, maybe despair is not the right word, but you're really hurting, okay? And the verses that God used for me that really turned me around were Revelation 4:11, where God says that Revelation 4:11 says, worthy are you, O Lord God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created. That verse, and then also as Isaiah 43:7. I was looking at cross references, and it basically, Isaiah 43:7 says, I have made my people for my glory. And it just dawned on me. It was like God just opened that up and showed me, this was not your baby. He was my baby. And I created him for my purpose, not for your purpose. And he fulfilled his purpose in you by changing you, by letting you know who's boss, by this is your path, basically. But it was more of, all of a sudden I realized that baby was not even mine, and I was acting like he was, and that I was almost kind of like mad, that I didn't, that's hard to tell somebody else. Now, I can give some of that testimony to somebody, but I can't tell somebody else, hey, that baby wasn't even yours. I mean, or if you do, you better be really sure you're led by the Spirit and the timing is right. But see, God can say that to me, and it was just like a light went on, and God had spoken, and I knew he had spoken, and that settled it for me. And that's what I've used many times.
So as you have helped other people, and Carol, you and Rachel just speak in where you want to. All right, so as far as some resources we're going to put in the show notes, God also used a situation with another lady in our church who had the same thing happen, and her name is Kathy, and you sat down and wrote her a letter. And so tell everyone what happened to this letter years later as you were talking to Kathy. So this became a way God used what he did with you and his baby. So tell us about Kathy. I got out my notes because my friend Kathy had several miscarriages, and she called me, or I can't remember how I found out, but we talked about it, that she had another miscarriage. So I got out my notes that I had taken right after after David was born, and I went through them, and I wrote her a letter and said, this is what happened to me, and this is what God showed me. And then I forgot about it. I didn't think another thing about it. She thanked me for it. Then 10 years later, she called me again for something. We were talking about something. She lived in a different town. We lived in different towns. And she said, I sent someone your letter. And I said, what letter? And she said, the letter you sent me after I had my last miscarriage. And I thought about it. I honestly didn't, I hardly remembered. I said, oh, okay. I said, why did you send it? And she said, well, it's just, what I do is I copy it and I send it to people because it helped me. So I thought maybe it'd help other people. So I said, well, what did I say? And she told me, and I said, well, would you send it to me? So she sent it to me, and I looked at it, and it's like a lot of things you think, I can't believe this would, that she really, this helped her, So I thought, well, if it helped, okay. So I made it into a little booklet. It's called Dear Kathy. And we have some little counseling booklets that we use for women, and that's probably the most used booklet that we have, that kind of gives a story and what God, it doesn't really give the whole story, but it kind of shows what God showed me about the fact that was not his baby, that was not my baby, that was his. And we'll have in the show notes where you can get the Dear Kathy.
Right.
And again, let me give one other thing, and I'll let Carol and Rachel, say what you want to say. So another way God used this with David in our life, we were at the funeral, so we decided to have a funeral, as Gretchen said. So our pastor was, at this time, was Will Sin, who now pastors in Colorado. And he brought the message, and we had extended family. It's a very small service, but we wanted extended family. And actually, it was my brother-in-law's mother was there. And Pastor Sin went to the passage in 2 Samuel. And 2 Samuel 12:23, when David, when they had their child was born dead, and King David said, I will go to him. And so very clearly, he gave the biblical hope that the infants, where are they? What happens when a soul is formed? And he gave the biblical hope that this child is in heaven, that David had the promise under the inspiration that David would go to him. And my brother-in-law's mother, who this has probably been 40 years earlier, had this happen to her, and for 40 years she had no idea what had happened to that infant spiritually. So you just never know, what God, how God is going to use.
It gave her a lot of comfort. It gave her so much comfort.
Comfort, and that's 2 Corinthians 1 being lived out. So we really don't know how God can use these situations. All right, so Gretchen, first, anything else you want to say, or really, and this will be women helping women. So we're challenging churches here, have ladies prepared. And again, we'll have Carol Loescher and Rachel Brilla's emails in the show notes where, ladies, if you need some comfort or help, as well as Gretchen's email, you can do that. So, Gretchen, anything else you want to add to this?
I like the way you keep using the 2 Corinthians 3 where it says, the God of all comfort who comforts us in all our...
2 Corinthians 1:3.
2 Corinthians 1, verse 3. And he says, it comforts us in all our tribulation, not so that we'll be comfortable,
Right.
but that we will use that comfort to comfort others. And I think if
So
a
that
person...
we'll be comfortable is my translation.
yeah. So I think the main thing is when we see God using something like that is a great source. Even, to know that there's purpose, that God is not random. He is very purposeful. He wants to make us like Christ. And the same things happen to us that happen to the worldly people who don't know God. But we need to have a different focus. We need to have a different response. And we need to see those as trials that have been entrusted to us to be able to help others in this sin-cursed world where there is a lot of death and suffering. And yet we have a God that ministers to us and uses those things for his glory.
Good. Rachel, anything you want to?
I really like how you say he's entrusted that trial to us, and he walks us through it. And not many people know that my husband is handicapped. And I remember asking him years, when we were early married, and why did God allow this in your life? And he's just like, well, and he kind of joke about it, I'd be perfect. But when we got to Africa in 1997, the first time we went there, he says, now I know why.
Yeah.
Because he
could see the purpose.
He lived that, and you've got to look at it as that God has a reason for this, and don't fight him, but allow him to use you. Because if you're not willing to be allow him to use you, then you're just going to fade into he'll find somebody else.
Mark has embraced that.
Oh, he has.
Yeah, and it's part of his.
There's a village there with a lot of handicapped people, and I know Walter had gone in, Carol's husband had gone in, and they received him fine.
Right.
But when Mark walked in, there was an instant bond.
Instantly.
Instant bond. And same with the women
Wow.
that have gone through the stillbirth or the miscarriage. There's that bonding there that knows no bounds. I mean, you can just reach out to anybody that has had that. It doesn't matter their background, their culture, their color, nothing. You have that bond.
That's amazing.
Dr. Loescher, anything else you want to add to this?
Sort of a medical bent to this is that a loss implies grief. And really, grief is very crushing, and it's an injury to the soul. And so I think that what pastors and church people have an opportunity to do is to help people to redirect and rebuild in a biblical way. And if we have an injured arm, we put a cast on it so that it heals well and not out of place. And so there is a danger in pregnancy loss that the mind and the emotions and even the spiritual life can heal in an unhealthy way. And this is where I think church and church people can come alongside and support, especially initially in the grief, but as the process continues, to help redirect and rebuild from a really biblical perspective to make sure that God's sovereignty and not guilt, I'm guilty, I had this loss, that I do something wrong, can be replaced with, no, God is perfectly sovereign. Amen. And he directed and he gave and he took, that kind of thing. That would be my emphasis.
Great. Thank you so much. All right, ladies, thank you. And again, we'll have the show notes where you can get the details for Rachel's email, Gretchen's email, Dr. Loescher's email. But thank you so much for your ministry. And Carol, just again, when we walked through this as a couple, Carol was right there. Mm-hmm. So I challenge any physicians listening to this, have compassion, as Dr. Loescher has shown so many. And then may we as a church show that compassion of Christ as we minister to those in our midst. All right, Rachel, thank you.
Thank you.
Gretchen, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Loescher, thank you. Great to see everyone, and we trust this will be a blessing to others. So for those listening, thank you for tuning in to ReChurch, sponsored by GFA Missions, and anything we can do for the ministry of the church, gfamissions.org is the place you would go. And thank you all for being here. You're listening to ReChurch, a podcast of Gospel Fellowship Association Missions. If you would like more information about our ministry or how we may assist you and your church, visit us at gfamissions.org/consulting.